Welcome to A Financial Advisor and Pastor Walk Into a Bar, King David, Part 2. In today's episode, Jason and Benji look at David's struggles before he was king. Let's have a listen. Welcome to a pastor. I did it again. Let's flip that. Welcome to A Financial Advisor and Pastor Walk Into a Bar. I'm Benjie Escara, Financial Advisor, and we have Jason Duke, as always, Pastor. And today we're going to episode 2, or part 2 of the series that we're looking into the life of David as a way to respond to suffering that is going on. And last week we kind of outlined what the series would be about. We talked a little bit about the early life of David, touching on him being anointed when he was a harpist for Saul, and also David and Goliath, the story of David and Goliath. Talked a little bit about that, along with the Psalms we looked into. And that's what we're trying to do, is look at what events were taking place, typically outlined in First and Second Samuel, and then also looking at the Psalms that were correlating with it to go and see what kind of emotions and feelings were going on with David. So, and this week we're going to be diving into a few more things of David before he took over his kingdom, and really focusing in on his life when he was running away from Saul. So, with that, I guess before we did the intro, David, Jason and I were talking about a few things in regards to David's life, and I think one of the things that I was talking about was his commitment to God, even though he's going through the struggles, but to follow the flow of what's going on in the Bible. I think where we wanted to go and start off with is when Jonathan was talking to David, and I guess David was coming to, or maybe both Jonathan and David were coming to the realization that Saul wanted to kill David, and David really had to go and come to that realization and start to run, right? Does that kind of paint the picture right, Jason?
It really does. It's interesting when, how do you tell your best friend, somebody that scripture says that they loved each other like themselves. And that's a beautiful picture of friendship, and especially masculine friendship. It's this friendship that can get perverted sometimes, in the world. I've heard some people talk about how, was there more going on between Jonathan and David than just this friend? Like, no, they were friends. There was a very, very healthy love for one another. And it was really, really cool when you study, their friendship. But
Yeah.
all that being said, how do you go to your friend and you confront him in a loving way and say, hey, your dad's trying to kill me? And of course, the friend Jonathan coming back, and and in scripture it says he's like, no, no, my dad wouldn't want to do that. And David is kind of having to push the issue and go, no, he's coming after me. I need you to understand that. I need you to get that he's trying to kill me. And then, of course, we see the subsequent story of how Jonathan discovers that truth for himself there in the palace when David doesn't show up for the festival. And then you just see everything after that. We see Jonathan's love for his friend and his care to make sure that David does not get the very outcome that his dad, King Saul, wanted of David. And so I've always loved this story between two friends because it's a beautiful picture of what friendship should look like, and how especially two guy friends have the ability to care for each other deeply, but yet care for each other in a way that lifts each other up and actually spurs you on closer to God. So
Yeah. And this point of the story for David is where we want it's kind of like a turning point from where he's being lifted up from anointed by Samuel, and then he wins a battle with Goliath, and then he's sort of
yeah,
being praised for all the victories that he's doing, and how well he's doing. And now he is on the other end of the spear, I guess, with Saul, and Saul doesn't like him. We see it being built up during the earlier time frames that Saul is not so happy with David and his success, and now it's made apparent that Saul doesn't like him, and he's going to go after him now. And so this is the point when we're starting to talk about struggles and what's going on with David and how he starts to feel. And looking at Psalms, we start to go and see a lot of I guess, the conflict, the struggle, maybe the frustration that he has during this time frame. And that's kind of what we wanted to focus on and be key to what is going on in his life that's described in Samuel, and how is he responding is really what we wanted to look at. And I think from this point when Jason, when David starts to run, that's when he gets into the next topic that we were talking about, which was the consecrated bread. And
Yeah.
uh, I think that's a good point to go and look at a struggle at this point.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's important to understand, try to get yourself in the mindset of David
Yeah,
as you talk about, he's transitioning from this place of, I'm the next king, or I've been anointed the next king, something he didn't ask for, something he never wanted. He's not even of the right family
right.
in order to achieve that position. And so as he gets older and things begin to happen, and next thing you know, he becomes this great warrior because of his faith in God and trust, his willingness to step out and do what God's called him to do. Now all of a sudden, King Saul begins to show an extreme level of jealousy because King Saul, understandably, realizes that, hey, my throne to pass down to my son and his family is in threat. It's under attack, if you will. That's the way Saul's viewing it, but of course we know that God had other plans. And yet David is just trying to be faithful.
Yeah,
David's just trying to do the very thing that he's been asked to do. He was asked to come into the king's palace and play the harp. He's been asked to do these different things, and now he's getting, trying to be crucified for it, or killed for it. And so I can only imagine where David's at of going, wait, what? What is
yeah,
going on? I didn't ask for this. I'm not doing anything. I'm honoring the king, and now you're trying to kill me. So then, of course, you find David running. And we pick up the story in chapter 21 where he flees to Nob. 1 Samuel 21, he flees to Nob.
yeah,
And while they're in Nob, he goes to the priest, and the priest is Ahimelech. And he asks him, he's like, hey, I need some food. It's kind of neat. They have this unique conversation where the priest asks him two questions. It's the same question, just asked two different ways. Why are you alone, and why have you come by yourself?
yeah,
And so, David has to lie because he's trying to cover his trails or cover his tracks. And so he tells him, I've been sent on this urgent message, but eventually David's like, I can't stay here. And so I got to go. And so very quickly he just says, hey, I need some food. And the priest says, all we have is the consecrated bread. Now, the neat thing about this bread portion is that the consecrated bread, or the bread of presence, as what would have been in the temple, that bread, once it's removed as the bread of presence
yeah,
and kind of given this position of consecrated bread, that only the priest can eat it. And so once it's taken off of its sitting place, is removed and then given to the priest to eat as part of their food. And so from that, only the priest can do that. So for Ahimelech to sit there and say, "Hey, all we have is this, but I'll let you have it, but with one thing," and that one thing is your guys can't have had sex or relations with women,
yeah,
sex. And so they end up taking it, and David says, "Hey, we haven't." So he ends up taking it. But what's also interesting about that is there was only 5 loaves, and these loaves would not have been giant loaves. These loaves would have been very, very small, but David was willing to take whatever he can. And then he says, "Was there any weapons here?" And the only weapon that he has is the sword, is the sword
yeah,
of Goliath. And so David takes 5 loaves and the sword of Goliath, and then he leaves. And he's in this place, he's in this mental place of just like, man, I'm stressed, I'm worried, I'm fearing for my life. I've got this band of raiders, if you will, that
yeah,
are with me, but everybody's out against me, and I don't know who I can trust. And
yeah.
so even with the priest, he doesn't even know if he can trust the priest too.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's I think this is a good one to bring up because what we were doing when we first thought about talking about David's life was trying to contrast this with the feeling of not having enough money, having this struggle because you don't have enough money to go and get the things that you feel that you need. And it causes a lot of anxiety, frustration. And David at this point, it's not that he didn't have money, but he really just didn't have food, right? And he didn't have protection. So it's one of those things. I would think that it's a similar feeling of desperateness, that's coming out that would cause you to be frustrated and angry is because you're looking for things that you believe you need, and you're maybe feeling like you're not going to be able to get it. And the thing that stood out from when you were talking about how David was through this point was that he was doing what he was supposed to do, right? You mentioned that, and he had even in the temple, the priest had said, "You and your men are not supposed to have relations if you want to have this bread," and he honored that as well. So he was doing what he's supposed to do, and he was still dedicated to following and being obedient, I think is what I'm picking up out of this, is that his character shows a one of obedience, and he's going to follow through with what he needs to do. And I think that's something that is not overlooked by God. And when we look at, and we'll look at this a little bit more, Psalm 52, I think is what I was looking at. And I'll kind of go back to that once we kind of get through the story with the consecrated bread. But the the story gets even more desperate and complicated, or maybe hurtful is a better way of putting it, is that while he was at Nob, there was another person there who was part of Saul's court who saw David there. And he reported this back to Saul. And Saul, then being upset with the priest, ordered the priest to be killed. And the priests were killed, and David knew about it. And I don't remember seeing it in the scripture that maybe it weighed on David, but I would imagine him going through asking for bread, and then the priest coming to go and help him, and then the priest died because of what they did to help him. I would imagine that would have weighed on him, along with having starvation there, having not the means to protect themselves because of weapons, and now there's I forgot how many priests died that day, but it was quite a bit, and it was all because they gave them the food to David, right? So this is all weighing on top of him. I'm sure there's a lot of mental anguish that's going on as he goes through this, and I think what I wanted to point out was in Psalm 52, the last 52:8. It says here, and this is the point that we are just talking about. He told Saul, and then Saul killed the priest. And in here, towards the end, David is writing about how these guys are boastful, and they're priding with their evil, and they think everything is good because of what they did. And then at the end of it, he says, "But I am like an olive tree flourishing in the house of God. I trust in God's unfailing love forever and ever. For what you have done, I will always praise you in the presence of your faithful people. I will hope in your name, for your name is good." He's praising God in this struggle. That's the main thing that I'm picking out of this, is that there's a struggle that's going on. He's been kicked out, right? He's being pursued. They're looking to go and kill him. He's got a dead or alive kind of poster that's on him, and they're starving, right? And then he's got all these priests that were killed because of something that they did for him, and he still has faith in God and hope, um, and that's what's going on in his head. That's where his head's at, I guess is the best way to put it. You know, I don't know. What do you think is going on here with him?
There's a weight, as you said, try to use some of your own words there for a moment. There's a weight that he is experiencing, and yet things aren't going well.
Yeah,
Things aren't going right. And I don't know if most of us, you and me, and even our, anybody listening, I don't know if most of us could sit there and say, "Hey, I know what it's like to have somebody pursuing me
yeah.
and trying to kill me." I think there's very few people that could, and at least consistently pursuing me. And
No.
then there's very few of us that could probably sit there and be like, I remember a day when I was so hungry because I hadn't eaten for maybe a couple days. I was
Yeah.
so hungry that I was just, I was at my end. I was at the end of my rope and I didn't know what to do. Um, that's not a situation most of us find ourselves or have ever found ourselves in. But yet, even in the midst of this extreme amount of struggle, even in the midst of having nothing and having your life pursued, like you said, he's chasing after God. He wants to be faithful.
Yeah.
Later on in scripture, it says that David was a man who chased after God's own heart. God loved David because he was a man who pursued him.
Mm.
And even when things are going bad, one of the things I was thinking about as I was just kind of reading through First Samuel, the few chapters that we were talking about, one of the things that stood out to me was, God provides an encouragement to bring us hope. Even in the midst of the junk and the struggle and the bad times of life, there are these times where God will just give us something
Mm.
just to remind us, hey, you're not alone. Just to remind us, I see you. Just to remind you, I am your daily bread or I am the living water. There's these little things that God will do just to get us to that next step.
Yeah.
And we always want God to just make it right, just make everything right all at once.
Right.
And that's not always what God does. And when you look at 20 and 21, on one hand, Jonathan, the friend, the son of the king, was that little bit of hope of just saying, hey, I'm going to make sure you don't die. I'll communicate with my father and I'll pass the message along. And if he's trying to kill you, I'll tell you how to get out of here. And he
Yeah.
gave him just a little bit of hope and he extended his life one more day. And then he gets to Ahimelech's place and they're in 21 and Ahimelech is like, all I've got is this bread. All I've got is this sword. It's the only thing I have. But that bread was just a little bit. And I can only imagine, think about it this way. Have you ever found yourself in a place where you experience the goodness of God, and yet fast forward 2 years, 3 years later, you find yourself in a very, very stressful, hard time. And you're just questioning, how am I going to go on? What is God going to do to provide? How am I going to provide?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, God gives you something and he gives you that hope. I can only imagine when Ahimelech says, I don't have any sword except for the sword that you took from Goliath after you killed him. And it kind of hit me as like, here's Ahimelech with this sword. David didn't even know the sword was there. I mean,
Yeah.
because a number of years have passed by. David's an older man by this time, not old man, but he's older
Right.
than when he was a young boy and he killed Goliath. David may not even know where that sword ended up.
Right.
But then all of a sudden, Ahimelech says, "Hey, I got this sword that you took from Goliath when God gave him over to you and you killed him.
Yeah.
I've got that sword." And I can just imagine David like, and he sees the sword and he pulls it out. And he's like, my God's got me. My
Yeah.
God's got me. I killed a giant because God slayed him.
Right.
My God's got me. And all of a sudden, this sword with a little bit of bread just became this huge ray of hope to go, I can get through this. And I just love how God gives us these small things of hope to get us to the next step. And I can imagine what that sword would have been like for David in that moment.
Yeah. That is a really good point, and I think I can tie this to something that happened in my life, not to
All
go
right.
in parallel with it, but to show how I went on a detour. So the what you had said was, is there a time when you were kind of like at wit's end and then God gave you a little bit to kind of push you further? And the example with the sword that David killed Goliath with was, that's like it's a little bit to push you further, but I mean it's like wow, yeah, this is the sword I killed Goliath with, right? There's nothing else like it. I think he even said that there's nothing else like this, and he took
Yep.
it, and I'm sure that pumped him up to get to the next step, right? And that's probably what God wanted to give him enough to get him to that next step, whatever struggle comes up. And the example I was thinking in my head, not the same obviously, but it's this idea of being at wit's end and then being given something that kind of gave me enough to go forward, which was I was in a transition from work, and I was in a sales role that the sales pipeline dried up. And so we were using all our savings to go through this. And it was a frustrating, very, very frustrating. And if you've been in sales and you know that your pipeline is dried up, you know what's going to happen in the next few months. And that's what happened. Nothing came in. And this was during the holidays, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. And so it made it that much more difficult. And so I was at that point where I was just getting really, really frustrated with God and saying, why are we going through this? Why are we going through this again? And then he kind of gave out this job with my current company, and it was one of those things that I was preparing for that job interview because I was thinking I got to get this, I got to put everything I can into it, and so I prepared the night before the final interview, which was the first interview. I got to meet with the decision maker for my first interview, and so. I wanted to make sure that my best impression. So I put everything I could together, tried to go and game plan everything, all the questions that I thought would happen, all this sort of stuff. I spent hours to go and prepare for it. And then I go into the interview, and the person that recommended me did such a good job. Preparing the interviewer as to who I was, and the interviewer looked at my resume and saw what I did. That I was thinking I'm going to go this way, in terms of the interview, and he just went in a totally different direction. And a good way to show that is that I was thinking I'm going to go and sell and do a presentation in front of his desk, right? And that's what I was poised to do. He goes and gives me a curveball by saying, "Oh, let's go over to the couch over there and let's have a seat." And that kind of threw off everything to make my head think I got to go and do some gymnastics here, right? And we get to the couch to go and start talking, and he goes and starts telling me, okay, so here's what the role is, and he starts going in a direction of here's the job. This is what you have to do. Is this something you think you want to do? And I was along
Yeah.
the lines of thinking, where's the questions asking me if I can do it, right? And by
Yeah.
the time we were done with the interview, the feeling I got was I got the job. And the experience that I had going through the interview was I didn't do anything, right? And it was like God telling me, you don't have to do anything because I'm in control, right? You thought you were in control preparing and all this sort of stuff, but I've already had this planned out and you have it, right? So that's like David getting the sword, right? I had this awesome feeling. I was like, great, this is awesome. Um, I think let's go to the next chapter to see, how did David respond when he got the sword? And then I'll tell you how I responded after I got I got this job. Um, so David got the sword,
Yeah.
and when he when we go to the next chapter, no, this was, I don't know if this was after he played like he was, crazy. Remember that? But there was
Oh
a
yeah, they're
point,
gas.
yeah, when he was over at Gap and he acted crazy because he didn't, I don't know what the reason was, but I'm gonna skip over that and kind of go to the next part, and which I think was in 21, no, 23. It was in First Samuel 23, and that chapter opened up by saying there was some Philistines in um, Kula, I think
Gila.
is that what it is?
Gila.
Kila.
Gila.
Yeah. Okay. So in Kila, there was these Philistines, and he had asked God, should I go and attack them? And God responded in the positive. He said, yes, go ahead. And then his men came back to him and said, we're scared, right? And so he goes back to
Yeah.
God
Yep.
and asked him. And God says, yes, go ahead. This is what I want you to do. And I think it's further down in the
Yeah. Go at
chapter as I
once.
was listening to it, he continues to go back to God asking him for guidance, right? And so I look
Yeah.
at this and I look at, here's the response that David had. This was after those priests were killed, right? And he probably got word of it, and things didn't get better after he had got that sword. The situation didn't change. He was still on the run. And his response to God or his faithfulness to God didn't waver. It was still the same. He was still dedicated and committed to God, is really what it looks like to me when I look at those chapters 21 through 23. And the difference, if we go back to my story, is that, I got that job, which I'm still in the job, right? I'm very thankful for the job. But as soon as I hit another headwind in that role, I wavered. It's not like I responded like David did and went to God and was dedicated and thinking, okay, God's got the answer. Let me go and do this. I had a problem in my job or a problem with the kids or something that was going on with our fostering. And immediately I went back to who I was and forgot about the fact that, hey, God showed me that he was in control and God told me, that you can do what you want, but I'm going to go and do what I'm doing, right? Forgot about it all. And that's the thing
Yep.
that I think I run into a lot. And it's a thing that I have a hard time wrestling with is the fact that I just, I guess I forget, and my heart is still stubborn to go and say I can either do it myself or I can impact it myself or I don't know. I'm sure you
No.
don't know anything about what I'm talking about, right?
No, that's a foreign feeling to me,
Ah,
and faith is so strong that I always, I mean, and I say, oh no, totally joking, no. Uh, as you were listening, of course, in my mind, situations where I've done the exact same thing.
yeah.
I'm just like, and you find yourself, you're like, um, I had so when difficult stuff happens, I find myself falling into this trap of oh my gosh, what, it's just like, and so I wrote down on a piece of paper in my journal on like the front page, so that way I'd constantly see it and I could remember it every time I open it, is I wrote down like 10 or 11 things that just remind me
Hmm.
to have right perspective in the midst of those things. And so I'll read a couple of these things that I wrote because they're encouragements for me. And
Yeah.
here's what I wrote: when discouraged and questioning why things are the way they are and why they are so tough, read this. Big words, read this! Exclamation point. First, pray, 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 and then pray some more. Second, this is not the first time I've ever faced a difficult circumstance, person, or season. Every time I have overcome because of God's strength and persistence.
Hmm.
Another one, it's going to get tougher, but it will eventually get better. Another one, God has called me to do hard things because he will see me through it, because he wants it, talking about the situation or whatever it may be, he wants
Yeah.
it to change. God created me to fight hard and to fight through it just because he wants it to change. So I wrote down, there's a few other things that I had to write these things down because I found myself kind of like what you're talking about, forgetting what I've experienced and what I've been through and how God has overcome those things to see me through it. And then every situation or every time something would happen, it was like, oh no, I've never experienced this. And then
Yeah.
God kind of smacked me upside the head one day and was like, dude, what are you doing? You've experienced this stuff before. I'm going to help you through it. And then, so this was my way of kind of doing that. But also, as you were talking, the other thing that stood out to me was I think it's so easy oftentimes to look at men and women in the Bible, and we look at one story in their life,
Hmm.
and we're sitting there, we're looking at that story, and we're trying to apply that one story to our life or how we respond. So in David, we look at him and we're like, man, he continued to pursue God repeatedly, even in the worst of the situations. And then we compare ourselves, but we oftentimes reflect on the worst and how we didn't do what
Hmm.
David did. But I think it's important to remember that there are other times in David's life when he didn't respond that way.
Yeah.
And it gives hope in the sense of remembering, like, you know what? David made mistakes and learned. I mean, specifically, I'm thinking about Bathsheba.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
David made a huge mistake. And he instead of turning to God and going, God, what is it that I need to do to make this right?
Hmm.
I cheated I cheated on one of my best soldiers. I cheated with his wife, and now she's pregnant. God, how do I make this right? And instead, he thought in his own power and his own strength and his own position to fix the situation,
Yeah.
and it still all fell apart horribly.
Yeah.
And then, yet, after losing his child and everything, God restored him because of a contrite and repentant heart.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember those times as well, because they don't always go the way that we see in scripture. Sometimes that same person will do things horribly too, and we need to remember that. We need to be able to compare our good times to their bad times and say, hey, you know what, I'm growing, I'm a work in progress as well, and
Yeah.
I'm demonstrating some good times as well. So
Yeah, the Bathsheba story is really good, and I'll be great when we get to that point in the
yeah,
episodes, because the response that he had when the child died was he worshiped after after the child
yeah,
died, and
oh yeah,
that was something that stood out to me when I read that. I just thought, wow. I would not have thought to
yeah,
go to temple after my child died to go in and worship, you know. So that again
yeah,
speaks to, like you said, he learned his lesson in that instance and kind of went to God as his response to that struggle that he was going to. And I think when you were saying that there are times that he didn't, make the steps forward, he stumbled, and that's something that I think just kind of reflects God's margin for forgiveness. There's forgiveness that's in
oh yeah,
the things that we're doing, right? And I guess it's just something to say we can't be too hard on ourselves as we're going through this conversation about suffering and how we're supposed to respond and what does God want us to do when we're responding. We can't forget the fact that we're not perfect and that we're going to continue to stumble as we're trying to go and do what we think he wants us to do. And when we do make that fall, I guess we shouldn't just be too hard on ourselves on that fact either. And just and be thankful that God's forgiving in that sense, right? Um, I think
yeah.
one before we kind of close out on this, I think one last thing too that I wanted to throw out there, because I'm going through Psalms on a separate, study, just devotionals that I'm doing in the morning, and it's like a psalm a day. And the thing that I'm in maybe 49, I think was this morning, but what seems to
Okay.
be interesting that's coming up is that a lot of the language, at least where it's from David, it's the same thing. He's kind of going through this cycle of being woe is me, I'm frustrated, and then going back to something like, I'm like an olive tree flourishing in the house of God, trusting God's unfailing love. He kind of goes back to that sense, and I think in my tiredness going through it, I'm just like, wow, here we go again, right? And I'm just thinking, okay, is there anything else that these Psalms are going to be focused on? But I think about my journaling, and it's the same sort of format where I go and say, I say my thanks, and then I kind of list out characteristics of God just to remind me, who you are, God, and let me know that you're there. And it's just I
Yeah,
guess for me to go and see that I am doing sort of the same sort of repetitiveness that he's doing in Psalms, it makes it
yeah,
more real to me that okay, he's experiencing something, and he's like we said last time, you're comparing it to journaling with the Psalms, is that he's writing this down, and it seems to be the same messaging that he's going through. Um, but I'm doing the same thing in my journaling, is that I'm writing things down, and it seems like the same thing. And that's kind of interesting to see that there's a parallel with how I feel and how I'm expressing it and how he was feeling, and he expressed it in the psalm. So, but I don't know, that might be stretching a little bit.
no, there's two things in life we know we're always going to deal with:
Yeah.
hardships and triumphs. um, you know, Low times and high times, depression and joy. However you want to categorize that, those are the two things in life we're always going to deal with in different ways at different times. And unfortunately, due to a number of factors, some of us deal in one more so than the other, and sometimes it's due to chemical imbalances, which is not something, apart from medication, you can control. And
Yeah.
so people find themselves in a more depressed. It's always try to tell people who find themselves more in that state of mind, hey, hang in there. Don't like look down upon yourself. There's more going on than just the way you're choosing to look at life. But in the midst of all that is, in thousands of years of human history, things haven't really changed.
Yeah.
Technology has changed. There's all these other factors that change around us, but humans haven't changed a whole lot in terms of the two major things that we're going to deal with are the highs and the lows in life and anything in between. And so the fact that you find yourself almost identifying or experiencing the same thing is not surprising, just because, yes, we look at King David as this great model of how to chase after God's heart and to
Hmm.
become a man known for pursuing the heart of God, but yet he was still a human being.
Yeah.
And he still had his highs and he still had his lows. He had his ups and his downs. And he's a human being just like the rest of us who are dealing with our own stuff.
Yeah.
And he had a job and we have a job. He had family, we had family. All that stuff's the same.
Yeah.
We just get to we get to hold him up oftentimes on a pedestal and an unrealistic pedestal
Yeah.
as being this guy who could do no wrong. But when you really get into scripture and look at it, you're like, oh my gosh, he did a lot of wrong, but he also had a lot of lows. That it's not a wrong thing, but it's just not a joyous time of life. He had a lot of that too.
Yeah.
And so, we
Yeah.
find
And
ourselves in the same boat.
I think that is definitely a parallel with us and something that we can relate to with all the struggles. I think the thing to be cognizant of is that in his response, it was in faith and trust that he had in God. It's something that I don't know how it was
Yeah.
ingrained in him, maybe when he was a younger child. Maybe it's cultural, right? As to why I'm not in that space that he is. But he is always seems to be responding, even though he's frustrated. Because if I were to go and look at his psalm and then look at a prayer that I would have, is that I'll start off being frustrated and I'll tell God, this is why I'm frustrated. Why is this going on? But David would go down that route and then he'd flip it and then he would show his commitment. He would show his faith and his trust in God. And I don't. That's kind of what it amounted. I don't. And that is where I would like to be. That's what I would pray for. I'd ask God to help me get to that point. And maybe he's doing that, right? He's helping me get to that point, which is why I'm still struggling. Because it's only through a struggle that I may be getting there. But it's it's where I would like to be, I think, is and I guess a lot of people would say the same stuff. And then at the same time, I don't know if I like the way of how I need to get there. The path to get to where David
Yeah.
is. How I don't like that path.
Well, I know this is not Benji's counseling session by
Yeah.
any means or encouragement session, but dude, I hear you say that and I look back over, I mean, you and I haven't known each other for like, half your life or anything, but I look back over the 10 years or so that
Yeah.
we have known each other, and I look at seasons of your life and the way that you have persisted and pursued through those.
Yeah.
And I'm like, dude, you respond a lot more like David than maybe you give yourself credit for, which goes back to this whole thing of we put David on this pedestal
Yeah.
and we compare. I believe you've done a lot more of that than what you give yourself credit for. And so I just want to encourage you with that because you've been an encouragement and example to me at times. And I'm like, man, forget David. I just want to be like Benji. I'm like, David's even up here, but you know, so I
Yeah.
appreciate the way you've been a blessing to me in that because it's challenged me in my own faith and the way I look at things sometimes and fight through it. So
I
thank you.
appreciate that. And I mean, that kind of points out something that I had a conversation with earlier in the week with a group of guys, and it was the idea of there. If we don't have people around us, if we don't have that community that you and I have been talking about, you don't have those relationships, then you're walking this walk by yourself and you're not going to be able to see a a progression taking place because it's so incremental sometimes that you don't see it if you're the only one that's watching, right? Because like you said, over the past 10 years, you've seen things. I don't have that same perspective. And I've seen things on you that you probably don't see the same perspective, right? And it's only through us, not just you and me, talking about it, but having a community around us to go and see how we're changing, um, is
Yeah.
is probably essential. And that's probably, I mean, biblically, it talks about having relationships and having community, right? And the only one of the things that I think is beneficial from it is the fact, like you're saying, is that we don't see how well we're progressing, because of the vantage point, the viewpoint that we have. We have to have people around us to go and point that out, so that we don't get discouraged. Because it's a struggle. Jesus says, that's what we're going to have in this life. And James talks
Yeah.
about welcoming these struggles so that you get better. But you're not going to see how you're getting better when you're right there on the ground. And that's why the people that are around you are able to go and say, "Hey, did you notice how far you've been from 10 years ago?" Like you just said, and it's hard to, that I guess goes into another conversation that we can have for another episode as to why particularly guys don't want to go and have that kind of, community, I guess. It's one of those things where it's always what's going on right now, how are we going to go take care of it, instead of looking back to go and say, how far have I gone, since
Yeah.
I started, right?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be
All
a
right, well, I'm
third.
gonna say this just for the sake of posterity. Vulnerability. So we can talk about that another day, but just so we don't forget,
Yeah.
vulnerability, I think, is part of that key. But yeah.
Yeah, yep, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And being a guy, I will jump as far away as that from that as we can at this point, and say it's a good time for us
Yeah.
to go and stop. Um, I think
Very
we
true.
hit the mark. This has been a good conversation about David and how he responded to the struggles he was going through, in the early years before he took over a kingdom. I think, we may talk a little bit more about some of the stories that he had before he took over, the kingdom, but, we're going to start going into, when he takes over the kingdom and how his struggles change and what are some of the things that how he responded during that time. But, until then, I think we've wrapped it up. Things are good. And Jason, any final words before we jump off?
No, Benji, as always, man, I appreciate you taking the time and leading this and allowing me to be a part of it. But to all the listeners, I hope this has been a blessing to you all and look forward to visiting with y'all soon.
Absolutely. So, thanks, for listening, everyone. We'll see you at the next one. You've been listening to a financial advisor and pastor walk into a bar. Thanks for listening.